Our analysis of the Ministry of External Affairs budget this year points to several trends. In some ways, not very surprising. There is continuity in the amount allocated, in the utilization, but there are also in some ways some concerns about whether India can keep having its ambition to be a leading power, to pursue its influence and its interests abroad without the adequate financial resources and budgetary allocations in the future. So in this year, we had around 18,000 crore of rupees for the Ministry of External Affairs. That's around 2.2 billion US dollars. This share of around 18,000 crores, around $2 billion, has stagnated in the last 4 to 5 years. That's around 0.4% of the total budget. So there's some indication of stagnation there. And that has raised some concerns. For example, the Parliament's Standing Committee on External Affairs, which reviews the MEA's budgetary allocations, its functioning, noted in a very recently released report in December 2022 that, quote, "We do not find such a budgetary allocation in consonance with the country's rising aspirations and growing global stature," end quote. I think this indicates some of the concerns that India's diplomatic apparatus is being overstretched, that there is tremendous ambition, expectations, not only set politically here at home in India, but also from other countries around the world that look up to India to deliver more, whether it's on economic assistance, whether it's on diplomatic bargaining and influence in international institutions, and that gap, therefore, may lead to some disappointment. The Standing Committee had recommended a doubling of the MEA budget to 1% share of the total budget. So that would be around 4 billion US dollars or 35,000 crore rupees. That hasn't manifested. Obviously, this year we only saw a 4% increase over the last year's budgetary allocation. To address this gap, I think there are 3 to 4 important issues that we've noted and that deserve some attention. The first one is the predominant share of the MEA's budget that goes to economic and technical assistance abroad to other developing countries. This is a long-standing principle in India's foreign policy, the idea of South-South cooperation, of supporting other countries' developmental ambitions, particularly in South Asia, in the rest of Asia, also in Africa, and what's called the Global South. Of the 18,000 rupees crore that India allocates to the MEA, around 1/3, or almost 1/3 of this budget goes to development assistance, aid, technical assistance and cooperation to fellow developing countries. That's around 700 million US dollars that India deploys abroad to support these ambitions. Around 1/3 of this, or sorry, around 1/2 of this goes only to India's neighboring countries, except Pakistan and China. That's Afghanistan, Bhutan, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Maldives, Bangladesh, etc. So that, I think, represents very clearly India's priority in its neighborhood and the importance of growing together and achieving developmental objectives in tandem with the modernizing economies of its neighboring countries in South Asia. As in preceding years, Bhutan gets the lion's share of this. Bhutan is India's smallest neighbor, land neighbor, but received around 2,400 crores in terms of development assistance. This goes predominantly into the hydropower sector in Bhutan, where India has tremendous interests and is trying to develop a regional power grid with Nepal, Bangladesh, in Southeast Asia, these 4 countries together. Just to give you a sense of the proportion, this amount that goes to Bhutan, 2,400 rupees crore, is almost 10 times what India allocates in total to all of African countries, 250 crores. And this shows you again the importance that India manifests in its policy towards its neighboring countries. Another interesting trend is India, despite not recognizing the Taliban regime in Kabul in Afghanistan, has continued allocating budget and economic assistance to Afghanistan, around $25 million. So India is finding a way to continue supporting humanitarian developmental interests of the Afghan people, despite, of course, not recognizing, in fact, being worried about the new political dispensation in Kabul. This shows, I think, India's dual track policy. Sometimes it's unhappy about certain governments in its neighboring countries, but it finds ways to support civil society and keep its connectivity development projects going on. Another interesting trend that we see is the continuity on the Eastern Front with Myanmar. India has allocated around $50 million, 400 rupees crore to Myanmar to develop various connectivity projects there. These are some of the older legacy projects like the India-Myanmar Thailand Trilateral Highway, a road connection linking the state of Manipur in Northeast India to Thailand via Myanmar, and also the Kaladan multimodal project that connects the state of Mizoram in India to the Sitwe port in Myanmar. These are legacy projects, some of them 20 years old, but India is adamant about progress, in fact, has achieved progress on these projects, even if slower than desired, over the last 2 years, despite the coup and the military coup and the unrest and political conflict in some of these areas in northern Myanmar. There is, I think, one trend that we'd like to caution. Some limited analysis is there on often looking at these values that India allocates in its budget to certain countries and trying to interpret these as manifesting some political priority or diplomatic interest of India rising or falling according to these amounts. That's rather, I think, limited utility, because sometimes the exact opposite happens. Less budgetary allocation to some of these projects in other countries and economic assistance to other countries shows often that there's been a completion of these projects, and a rise in that shows that, in fact, you are beginning new projects. So I think it's rather useless often to look at these amounts and try to read into it whether India has a good relation with the new government in Nepal or is concerned about what's happening in the Maldives or in a certain country. And it's very important to look at the long-term trends in these budgetary allocations. Finally, one important issue is, for example, another trend that we've observed is that traditionally India has used its development assistance and its economic aid in the form of grants, which basically is free money, no-cost money to build and do development infrastructure and do development projects in its neighboring countries. The trend we've been observing is progressive change from grants towards loans and lines of credit. Very beneficial, low interest rate, long repayment horizons, lines of credit to its neighboring countries. But that trend has been quite clear in the last 10 years. So therefore, again, if you look at Bangladesh, for example, one of India's most important neighbors, the amount allocated under the MEA budget is around 200 crores of rupees, which is a minimal amount, in fact, again, 10 times less than what Bhutan receives. But at the same time, if you look at the lines of credit that India deploys under the Ministry of Finance, a completely different budget that is not represented in the MEA budget, these lines of credit and the financial effort that India puts into them go mostly to Bangladesh these days. Bangladesh has been one of the largest recipients of lines of credit worldwide. One other aspect that in the MEA budget is quite striking and is a welcome development is the growing budget towards training and staffing. India has been doubling its training budget over the last few years. These are various sort of programs, for example, the Foreign Service Institute, but also mid-career projects, for example, increasing joint civil military cooperation between Indian diplomats and Indian military officers. So there's a growing budget there to correct some of that capacity for India to train its diplomats, its foreign service officers at the beginning stage, but also mid-career and advanced stages. This is obviously a welcome development for many of us who've been arguing that India's foreign service remains severely understaffed. India has around 1,000 Indian foreign service officers in the A cadre, which is far less than most other countries, in some ways less even than very small countries in Europe and in Southeast Asia. So therefore, again, there is a bit of a stretch, and India will have to further increase its budgetary allocation, not only to train, but also staff and increase its capacity to deliver on many of its ambitions and expectations. Third aspect, beyond economic assistance and aid and training and staffing, is diplomatic missions. India now has around 200 missions worldwide in different countries, different multilateral institutions, capitals, consulates at the subnational level. But India has opened 23 new diplomatic missions alone since 2018. Of these 23 new missions, 18 are in Africa, but there are still 48 United Nations member states that do not have an Indian diplomatic mission. This budget this year reduces in 6% the allocation of the budget towards establishment expenditure, that is the budget to run India's diplomatic missions overseas. And this is a bit concerning because if India increases its diplomatic missions abroad, it will also have to find the financial capacity to staff them and to run them to pursue Indian interests. And in fact, it's very important to be represented in many of these countries because India seeks often the support of these countries at various United Nations initiatives. And on that note, we'll come to the last, last trend, which is India's budget for multilateral institutions. Interestingly, I think there's a report that India has allocated around 1,000 crores, that's approximately $120 million to organize the G20 presidency, which is certainly the topmost priority of India's diplomatic agenda this year. A variety of events and convening, and of course, the big summit later this year. There's been also an interesting budgetary allocation, in fact, a very large allocation towards India's regional institutions, SAARC and BIMSTEC in South Asia and the Bay of Bengal region, around 30 crores rupees towards these regional institutions, which is important for India to also invest in multilateral regional institutions. But one concerning trend or element in this budget is the amount budgeted for the United Nations. That has fallen by 50%. India has allocated around 200 rupees crore to the MEA for the UN budget. And that is even less than what the MEA budget allocates for the Nalanda International University, for example, in the state of Bihar for international education cooperation. That is concerning because India is now very active at the United Nations. It's been very vocal about the reform of the United Nations. It has been an active player in the recent membership of the United Nations Security Council that ended in December last year. And India is pushing on a variety of fronts at the United Nations system and various technical agencies also to pursue its interests. And as we know at the United Nations, most of what you get in terms of your diplomatic power and interests is a reflection of what you pay for and the various financial contributions to do. We've seen, of course, besides the US, which has been the top one contributor to the UN system, China raising its financial contributions across the UN system, and therefore also getting its respective influence in a variety of United Nations systems. Most recently, for example, in the pandemic response in the World Health Organizations, but also in various other UN technical agencies. So there again, with a limited budget from the MEA, it'll be very difficult for India to pursue its interests at the United Nations and in other international institutions. These are the four key trends that we observed in the MEA budget.